Hello, Tabernacle family. Great to be with you again as we continue our journey through the book of Ecclesiastes. We're in chapter 2 today, so if you go ahead and turn there, that would be fantastic. I want to remind you as well about our upcoming opportunity to participate in Sunday school. And again, just to clarify, that does not mean exclusively for the kids. That's for all ages. So we'll have an adult class, we'll have nursery right there, we'll have, of course, the kids classes there as well for you, and so please come, please bring your whole family, and that's going to be starting really the first Sunday in February. So be in prayer with us for that as we continue to approach, as the teachers continue to prepare, and we will joyfully begin all of that together in really just a couple of weeks. Time is getting pretty close right now for that. All right, have you turned there yet? Ecclesiastes chapter 2, I'll begin in verse 12. We're going to read through the end of the chapter. And I'll be reminding us just the similarity that this bears to the message of last week. The good news is, as the preacher continues, he gets some really hopeful words at the end. And we could probably all use a little hope in Ecclesiastes. So we'll be there. All right, chapter 2, verse 12 says this. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. So then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart, this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. Now, the wise dies, just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he'll be master of all for which I have toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned about, I gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This is vanity. It's a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind. Well, we finally approach our first really hopeful refrain in the whole of this book. And I want to remind you that this is sort of a cumulative case that is being laid out as we approach through this. So we're going to really culminate right there at chapter 12, but right now we're really laying the first bricks in that groundwork. And so we come to the end of this chapter and we get some really good payload that we finally get to enjoy. But he's bursting bubbles right now. You know what I refer to when I talk about bubble wrap, right? It's that thing that is somehow strangely addictive. I don't know, are you like this, where you kind of pop it? Myself and all my girls will go and just jump around on the stuff, and you hear it going pop, 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 pop. It's almost as though in life we know that there are hard things coming. And so we kind of want to wrap ourselves up, right? Kind of like that precious cargo in the box. You sort of wrap yourself up in the bubble wrap. But the problem is, unlike that thing which weighs, 2 ounces or 15 ounces or whatever it is, you weigh a bit more. And when you step on the bubble of the bubble wrap, it just pops. It cannot support your weight, diet though you may. We understand that. And yet, here we are in life, sort of wrapping ourselves up in bubble after bubble. Last week, we talked about a lot of them, didn't we? Just to remind you of where we've come, chapter 2 begins, I'll test you with pleasure. So I said of laughter. Verse 3, I said of wine. We talked about jokes. We talked about drugs. I made great works. We talked about arts and nature and money and music and sex and affirmation and work. And now he's actually going to start returning to the 2 things that really captured him most. He's already talked about wisdom. He's already talked about toil, work. He's going to come back to those things. It's strange how, I don't know, when's the last time you lost your keys? And so you started to make this search through the house. And then you said, I must have overlooked it. And so you come back, don't you? You come back to that spot on the desk where you always keep it, or that spot where you're supposed to hang it, whatever it is. You come back there and you look. Did I overlook it? It's a little bit what he's doing right here, where he has said, I've made a search, but let me return back here. Verse 12. I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. Not 3 things, just 2 right here. Sometimes we talk about these things just in a way that sort of encompasses everything in between. And when he says wisdom, it's not necessarily the way that Jesus would use the term, or the Apostle Paul would use the term, as in, life lived in pursuit of Christ. But wisdom in the sense of like Oprah or Dr. Phil, or last time you sat down with your psychiatrist, or maybe you read just some of these people who are trying to express life in ways that make sense, regardless of your political affiliation or anything. He's just trying to say, look, maybe it's Mike Rowe on Hard Jobs, right? And he's just trying to say, I'm just trying to tell you life as I see it. You might agree and you might not, but as wise as I can be, this is how it is. And so you think, well, that's wisdom. It's the Jordan Petersons of this world, and it's this sort of idea. And it may not have as much to do with Christ as we would want it to. Well, I turn my heart to consider wisdom. I also turn my heart to consider madness and folly. It works like this. Maybe you've lived all your life as a Democrat, and then you're now going to consider and turn to the Republican idea, or vice versa. It's what the one side calls madness and folly, and it's what the other side calls madness and folly. And you said, look, you know what? I'm going to really dive into this and really consider it. All your life you've been given to this X, Y, and Z, and now you're going to consider A, B, and C. And is there really anything to it? He's trying to say, I made as exhaustive of a search as I could possibly find. And what he found was rather predictable. He says that, well, there's more to be gained in wisdom than there is in madness and folly. And you're like, right. Attaboy, Solomon, way to go. Your heart, maybe as a parent, you want this for your child. At least relative wisdom. I have no greater joy than that my children walk in truth. So says John in the New Testament. And he's talking about spiritual children walking in spiritual truth. And we understand this. Our hearts relate to this. But there is some relative good here, right? And he talks about light and darkness. And really, you could almost translate this or paraphrase this kind of this way. There's more to be gained out of wisdom than folly, and it's as clear to me as light and dark. It's as clear to me as day and night. Well, someone might give themselves over to drugs, sex, and rock and roll. They might live this life of hedonistic abandonment. They might decide to engage in the current cultural sexual identity and sexual orthodoxy. And for them, sexual fulfillment is all that life is all about, including freedom, including political freedom, and that's all that life is. Solomon says, and that's kind of folly. You know what? It's better if you do, study hard and get a good job, and there's more to be gained in that. However, he continues, I perceived, I'm halfway through verse 14, that the same event happens to them all. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will also happen to me. Why have I been so very wise? I said in my heart, this is vanity. And he goes on and he really just piles phrase upon phrase upon phrase for the vanity, for the all will be forgotten kind of things. And I think it was 2002, there was a movie with, it was called About Schmidt. And in there, this author, this person decides to author this note to this child that he's sponsoring in Africa. And he says, I've lived all my life as this insurance analyst, and here I've retired, and you know what? There's just nothing to show for it all. I'm just going to die and be forgotten. Hope you have a nice life. Chuck Smith. And you kind of laugh a little bit about that. I suppose it's intentionally, ironically funny, but many a truth is said in jest. And so you come away from a movie like that thinking, wow, that's interesting. And maybe there's a little bit more to that than you care to admit. Maybe a little bit more famously, Tolstoy wrote about that. He says, at 55 years of age, I came to realize some very meaningful questions. Namely, what's the significance of all that I've been doing? What does it matter if I do what I do or I don't do what I do? And it really begins to color some of his work, doesn't it? If you haven't wrestled with that question, you may not have thought deeply enough. You will die and be forgotten. What does that do to you? If all that you're living for is declared as being under the sun, well, then it drives you to despair, much like it does to Kohelet, to the preacher, the teacher, right here. He says, it doesn't matter if you've been wise. It doesn't matter if you've been a fool. Death is the great equalizer. So what? It drove him to despair. And so he turns now, again, verse 18, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun. So with this in mind, he's gone through all these different pleasures and he's popped them one after another. The bubble wrap of life that's meant to insulate you from the pressures and the bumps and bruises of life. It's all been popped. You're coming head on to a collision into a brick wall. You see it impending. The doom is right there. And all that he can say is, well, here I am. I have to get up today. And what am I supposed to do? Go to work? Okay, so here I am, the wisest man. What can the man say who comes after the king? I'm the king. I'm the wisest. I'm the biggest. I'm the strongest. I'm the best at what there is. And what can you say to me? And we're all going to die. Well, yikes. And so here you have amassed this great wealth and you leave it to your kid. Well, maybe your kid's like Rehoboam. That's Solomon's son. And he rips the kingdom. And a man like Jeroboam, your former servant, jumps in. And now for the next hundreds of years, the nation that God blessed you with is alternatively in civil war and enmity. Good grief. It runs so deep that in Jesus' time, they called them Samaritans, right? Samaria, capital city of the north. There's still enmity and tension right there. Wow. And here Solomon says, who knows what my son's going to do? Or maybe it's not your son or daughter. Maybe it's somebody else. You work so hard, you amass all this wealth, and where does it go to? What happens to it all? It's vanity. Who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, says verse 19. Yet he'll be the master of all for which I've toiled and used my wisdom. This is vanity. So I turned about and I gave my heart up to despair. What do you gain for it all? Look at this verse right here, 22. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? It's the same question that he asked in chapter 1. You remember that? Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity. What does a man gain? That's the way he began the book. Essentially, he's concluding his first thought right here. And he's asking the same question. What do you have from it all? And the point is very deep, it's very profound. And I pray to God it affects the way you live. If you are living life trying to take, trying to gain, you're fundamentally living life the wrong way. If you live with the end in mind, live looking at death, you're going to die. Well, how should that affect the way you live right now? If you're trying to gain, understand it's grasping after the wind. It's oil through your fingers. It's vanity. It's hevel. It's smoky. It's empty. You can't do it that way. That has implications for your joy. Did you know that? So many times we just want to be happy, and so we make happiness our ultimate good. We make joy our ultimate good, and we pursue joy. Paradoxically, the more earnestly you pursue joy, the less likely it is that you'll catch it. Joy is a byproduct, not an end of itself. It's a very predictable byproduct. Well, now he comes to saying some things that are just marvelous. Verse 25, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. And you probably say, what? Wait, full stop. You just spent 2 chapters saying that all this eating and drinking is hevel, and all of this toil is hevel, and that you have no enjoyment. It's all vanity and despair, and the man is wallowing in depression. Now you do this about face and say, oh, and by the way, go find joy in all of this. I cry foul. How are you saying this? Now, for the first time, another player comes into this discussion. Did you notice how absent God has been from all of this discussion? And how all of his searching has been under the sun? One of the ways that you're able to highlight something in an ancient text is by repetition. You don't have italics, you don't have bold, underline, you don't have big headings, topic sentences, anything like that. Pardon me, you do have topic sentences. You don't have headings above the topic sentence. So you repeat it. And while God has been so absent up to this point, look at this. Verse 24, the hand of God. Verse 26, the one who pleases him God has given. End of verse 26, to the one who pleases God. Time and time and time again, Solomon is making a point. We have made an exhaustive search under heaven, under the sun, and it's all hevel. But what if you raise your eyes above the sun? What if you find something beyond what this life can give? And if that's the case, what does it look? Well, now all of a sudden, you're finding enjoyment in your toil. Work is not a curse. Work is a blessing. You have been made by a creative God to engage in the creative endeavor. And you might say, well, I'm not very creative. I challenge you on that. I think we're all rather creative because we've been made in the image of God. You might not have drawn with your oil paints on a canvas. You might not have played your instrument, but you create in your own way. You might have made that spreadsheet. You might have given that speech. You might have creatively developed a way for your kids to play. We're all terribly creative. Praise God for that. Find enjoyment in that. This is from the hand of God, not something to be gained, but a gift to be enjoyed. Boy, just on Sunday, we were talking about finding contentment as you are able to say something like this, not I, but Christ who lives within me. Take the world and give me Jesus. It's from the hand of God. For apart from him, verse 25 says, who can eat? Who can have enjoyment? The most basic functions of life come from God. Eating, breathing. It's his air. It's his food. He's the one who sustains your body. He does this for you. Give him credit for it and enjoy it. You understand it's been appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. That is irrevocable. You may not escape that. And so, knowing the one with whom we have to do, live your life before the eyes of him with whom we have to do, finding enjoyment in this. For to the one who pleases him, how do you please God? That's a loaded question, and the author here does not yet explain it. Now, we as Christians understand something that maybe the people who are first reading this book may not understand. That our joy is found in Christ, that we please God simply by following Jesus, by believing things. God says it, well then, do you believe that? And so he gives these blessings, wisdom and knowledge and joy. Those are fruits of the Spirit. You cannot have those apart from God. You cannot have authentic joy apart from him. You cannot have true wisdom. You can have pretenders to those things, but not the authentic thing. But to the sinner, well, who's the sinner? Well, I mean, you and I, we're all sinners. So he's meaning something different than one who has sinned. Rather, it's one whose way is marked by sin. The fool who has said in his heart, no, God. To the sinner, God has given the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. Boy, what vanity that is. And things like Israel entering the land of Canaan should come into your mind, where God has now given to the one who pleases him. Boy, lots of illustrations for this. I suppose one, where were these at? In Nebraska. This is during World War One. This was a bunch of Dutch farmers who, were religious, kind of a Dutch reform sort of thing. And they came under, well, a lot of attack because, after all, Dutch does sound pretty close to German, and it's the war years, and there's some conspiracies against them, and some relatively evil people decide to vandalize these farmers, and it was awful. They lost greatly. FBI gets involved, the plots are exposed, and um, the people who were fomenting these plots end up doing some jail time and such. Well, after the war, here it is, the Roaring Twenties, and then the Depression of the 30s. But some of these very instigators ended up going into foreclosure, and here their properties are now sold at bargain basement prices. And guess who ends up buying them up? It's the very same Dutch farmers who were so persecuted. This is maybe an example of the way that this might work in life, where this one who is just trying to seize and grasp and accumulate in life ends up giving it over to the righteous person. Now, that's a bit metaphorical, right? A bit proverbial, maybe, pardon me. And not always the case, because sometimes you see the righteous oppressed. And so here we are again, being called to lift your eyes to something not just under the sun, to something a little higher than and better than. That's my encouragement to you today. Odds are, in our lay of the land, things are going to get a whole lot worse for us before they get a whole lot better. I mean, maybe for the next 20 years or more. Who knows? I am not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, right? Uh, but maybe this earthly and proverbial fulfillment may not be our lot for right now. But the eternal fulfillment most assuredly will be. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And so may you, as well as I, enjoy life as a gift right now, knowing that it only gets better on the other side.